Periodization is essentially how do you plan your training to reach an end goal. Welcome back once again to the Verse Fitness Podcast. I am your host, Shane Robert. I'm the head product designer at Verse, and I've been a personal trainer for about 20 years. I'm talking to you on a Sunday morning, and these are often my favorite days because these are the days that I almost always take off, unless I have some weird schedule conflict that means I'm going to miss a day during the normal week that I would then try to make up for on a Sunday. But generally, I'm taking them off, and I just really appreciate having a day off because my training right now has been pretty hard. It's pretty high volume. I'm definitely feeling the stress of the volume and frequency. So my recovery is being pushed. So having a day off is something that feels really nice, which made me think about training in general and periodization. Now, last week, if you listened to our podcast, I talked about the concept of progressive overload. And progressive overload, just a real quick recap, is just doing more work over time. How do you progress? And we talked about many different ways to do that. If you're interested, check out that episode. From progressive overload, we get into what's called periodization. Periodization is essentially how do you plan your training to reach an end goal. So almost all training you do these days falls into the category of some kind of periodization. If you're just going in with no plan other than try to do more, it's not exactly periodization, but most things written out on the internet or espoused by various coaches, there's some form of periodization. And since we're going to talk about periodization, we might as well start with the OG periodization, which can be referred to as classical or Western periodization. This is the first model of any sort of thought out structure to training. The idea behind it was created by a former Soviet sports scientist named Leo Medvedev. And the idea was they wanted the Soviet government liked control. And they wanted to be able to say, on this date, our athletes will be X amount better. And on this date, they will perform and lift this weight. Medvedev studied a bunch of different sports science from the time. He looked at different training journals, talked with a bunch of athletes, and came up with this model we now call classic periodization. The concept is very simple. You start with a high volume of work at relatively low intensities, and then work your way down systematically over time to whatever your end date may be with lower volume and higher intensities. It becomes this kind of pendulum or swapping of volume to intensity being weight on the bar or percentage of 1 rep max. By following this structure, you can very predictably say, okay, I will get this much stronger, and on this date, the date of a very important competition. In this case, they were looking at Olympic weightlifters, so maybe this was the Olympics, maybe it was a world championship, maybe it was a national competition. They wanted to know, this is the date, and we're going to be able to perform this way. The concept was pretty revolutionary because at the time, people had pretty much only been doing progressive overload type training. One of the first true studied programs was what's called progressive resistance exercise, PRE, and it's where we get the famous 3 sets of 10. The concept there was you would take a set of 10 reps at 50% of your 10 rep max, a set of 10 at 75, 80% of your 1 rep max over. 50% of your 10 rep max for 10, 75 to 80% of your 10 rep max for 10. Then you take 100% of your 10 rep max and you do as many reps as you can. When you can do 10 or more, you add weight. This is the most simple progressive overload scheme, right? This we talked about last episode. This program, this 3 sets of 10, was the first truly studied program in the world. It was done in a scientific setting for rehabbing patients from World War II. It's called the Delorme method. It was Dr. Delorme and Watkins. They did this in the late 1940s, working with World War II soldiers who had been injured and needed to build muscle in a form of physical therapy. So here comes Medvedev some years later in the 50s, and he starts this experiment. And he wants much more concrete control and examples of how to take an athlete to that desired endpoint rather than just when they're ready, you add a little bit of weight, or when they do 11 reps, you add a little bit of weight. It needed to be much more controlled and systematic. So what he came up with to put this idea of start with a high volume and low intensity and working your way to low volume and high intensity is this classic periodization model. Each training block is broken down into different goals, typically lasting 3 to 4 weeks. Each block would feed into one another, but with different goals. The first block was generally considered a general preparation type block. The idea is to prepare the body for all the stresses that are going to be coming later on when the weights get heavy and the volumes are still high. That's kind of where I'm at right now. It's a lot of stress on your body. And so this general prep block was to try to increase strength endurance, increase general motor abilities through a lot of repetitions. You get better at a movement. If you want to shoot free throws, you go out and you shoot a lot of free throws and you practice. You don't go, okay, I shot 3 free throws. Now I'll go and do half court shots exclusively, which I can barely do and miss all the time, right? So you want to practice and get really good. You want to increase your cardio so that you can handle the training that's going to come. You want to build some muscle. This 3 to 4 weeks would be something like 3 to 5 sets of 8 to 20 reps. The volume would start at around 40% of maybe your maximum recoverable volume, which is to say the amount of work you can do and still recover from and improve each session. If you do a certain amount of volume and next time you come in to do that similar session, be it a week later or a few days later, and you actually have to regress because you haven't recovered, then you've exceeded your maximum recoverable volume, or you haven't waited long enough in between sessions. The volume starts at around 40 over the block, progressing to around 100% of maximum recoverable volume. The intensity similarly starts at 40% and progresses to around 70%. Now, you might think, oh, 40% is really low. And it is, except when you think about the context of maybe doing 20 reps. Even 50% on certain movements for 20 reps, ooh, that's killer. 40 might seem right. The second part of this prep block is a specialized prep. And it's another 3 to 4 weeks and is considered part of this higher volume block. Progressing from 40 to 100% of volume fits into this block as well. So it's not like at the end of that first 4-week general prep block, you're at 100%. It's feeding into this special prep block as well. In this one, you're going to be looking to build a little bit more basic strength and get a little more specific on your motor learning abilities. And in this case, you're going to be doing 3 to 5 sets of 4 to 6 reps probably. And again, you're progressing more towards that 100% volume, 70% of weight type of thing. These athletes who are running this kind of model in the former Soviet Union might be working out more than once a day, and certainly many times a week, up to 6 times a week, 3 to 6 in general, and maybe multiple times a day. If you say, oh, 3 to 5 sets of 4 to 6 reps, let's say that's a classic 5x5. You go, that may not be that much volume. If you're going to do that multiple times a day or multiple times a week, that volume really starts to add up. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about volumes in this discussion. So that first preparation period, we're looking at probably 8 weeks. Once that's completed, you're going to transition into what's called a competition prep or block. And in this case, you've started at 100% of your volume. And now we're going to start swinging that pendulum the other way where the volume's coming down and the intensity is going up. You're going to start this block at about 100% of your maximum recoverable volume. And you're going to be doing that with 3 to 5 sets of 2 to 3 reps. I should make a note about reps that this is Olympic weightlifting, and these are highly technical movements, and you wouldn't really want to push the reps on them where you're lifting through a lot of fatigue, because then your technique starts to break down. Even if you can complete the lift, it does good, and you're teaching your body bad habits. If you're using 70 or 75% of your 1 rep max and you're a highly efficient Olympic weightlifter, you could probably muscle out extra reps, but they're going to be ugly and they're going to be ingraining poor positions and motor habits. Generally speaking, you're staying pretty far away from that failure point. You're working with somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of the max amount of reps you theoretically could do with a specific movement. So that's why in this case, it's 2 to 3. We're going to talk about some adaptations to this model in a little bit, where the reps kind of change to make more sense for different, more traditional strength movements like squats and things of that nature. But the competition prep, you're starting at 100% of your volume. Your intensity is in that 60 to 70% range where you ended on the general preparation block. And you're going to slowly, over these 3 to 4 weeks, you're going to drop that volume from 100 to about 60, and the intensity is going to go from 70-ish to around 100%. So again, in that 2 to 3 rep range. As you do that, lifting becomes harder. You need to start taking a lot more. You need to respect your recovery a lot more, because after this block, which is the hardest block, because volumes are still high and intensity is high, and this is where it takes its toll. From there, once we've really increased our sport-specific abilities, which is much heavier lifting, closer to 1 rep max, we're going to transition into the immediate pre-competition phase. This is the most sport readiness, the most sport specific. You're doing 1 to 3 sets of 1 to 3 reps in that 80 to 100% zone. Volumes are the lowest, but intensities are the absolute highest. This is where you're going to get the majority of your 85 or 90% plus lifts in a training cycle. And what we're trying to do in this period is drop fatigue as much as we can. And that's usually a result of a lowered volume. When you reduce training loads through volume, it's much easier to recover, even though the weights are heavier and it feels like intuitively you would think, oh, it's heavy loads. In a sense, yes, sometimes heavy loads, but it's really the volume of loading that wears you down. So you're dropping that volume way back. The intensities are really high. You're hitting those very sport-specific percentages. And since this is weightlifting, sport-specific means how much can you lift for 1 rep, heavy weight for 1 rep. So getting close to that 100% level, that's the most sport-specific. So that's the basic structure. You've worked your way from this high volume at low intensity and whittled away, lowering the volume over time, increasing the intensity, all the way up to a competition on X date. You've now broken a world record, set a PR, whatever. The final block is just a 4-week transition block, which would be considered some form of active rest or even fun. This, in the former Soviet Union, this would be things like playing soccer or volleyball, hiking or whatever. The idea is to actually get away from lifting for a little while, do stuff to keep your body moving, nothing that uses the same kind of stress patterns on the body. This is the traditional model, the classic model of periodization that Medvedev presented to the world and implemented with the Soviet weightlifters to really a lot of success. In the West, the US specifically, this idea was taken by various sports scientists, often attributed to Dr. Mike Stone out of Auburn University, but Harold Bryant was part of this, John Garhammer, and others. And if you don't know these names and you want to learn anything about periodization, you definitely need to look these names up, because they are integral, at least in the United States, to the whole discussion. But regardless, they took this model and adapted it to a little bit more of a US sensibility and presented a program style. Really was very successful in the sport of powerlifting. I don't know how much it was embraced by Olympic weightlifters in the West, but it was very embraced by powerlifters. If you need examples, we can look at people like Bill Kazmaier use this style of training, Ed Coan. And if you don't know who Ed Coan is, definitely look that up. He's widely considered the greatest powerlifter of all time. Kurt Kowalski, tons and tons of powerlifters in the 70s, 80s, and at least the first half of the 90s were running this type of training. So the Mike Stone style of periodization follows the same pattern of high volume, lower intensity, working your way to that higher intensity, lower volume. But the first block is that 3 to 4 week block of hypertrophy training, 3 to 5 sets, 8 to 12 reps each. Second block, basic strength block, 4 weeks of 4 to 6 sets, 4 to 6 reps. Third block, strength and power block, 3 to 5 sets, 1 to 5 reps. Final block, peaking or maintenance, 1 to 3 sets, 1 to 3 reps. Peaking is that final push right before competition when you're the most efficient at those sport-specific movements. In this case, because it was a little bit geared more towards powerlifters, or at least embraced by powerlifters. That's 1 rep maxes on squat, bench, and deadlift. So this is how it was adapted. The classic periodization was adapted in the West to a lot of success. There's a ton of lifters who used this back in the day and honestly are still using it to a lot of success. In the modern era, this model gets a lot of negative feedback around it, frankly, by people that I don't think have ever really used it to its fullest extent. And I'll acknowledge that it's not perfect. Even Medvedev acknowledged that it wasn't perfect. In fact, for athletes who weren't weightlifters, say they were in some other sport, he admitted that there were a lot of problems with it, especially at the beginning, because it's hard to do your sport practice when your legs are super sore from doing 5 sets of 20 on squats. He totally acknowledged that. We're not necessarily talking about non-weight training athletes in this case. But if you're a weight training athlete, powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, something like that, I think that a lot of the negative criticism that classic periodization has received is less valid. But there are definitely some criticisms. The first one is that any program that runs purely off of percentages, in this case, percent of 1 rep max, is inherently flawed because your strength can fluctuate day to day by quite a bit. So if you're 1 rep max, when you're peaked at a competition, you have a ton of emotional and mental arousal, that's not the same as, okay, now I'm a few weeks removed from that peak and I don't have as much emotional and mental arousal, and I was up all night because my kid was sick and I forgot to eat a couple meals yesterday because I was in 2 meetings. Your strength isn't necessarily reflecting what you were once capable of. So basing things off 1 rep max can always be a little bit dicey. If you plan accordingly, where the percentages are conservative and even maybe your starting max is a little bit conservative, it becomes less of a problem. Trying to base things off of percentage and say, okay, today you have to do 65% for 4 sets of 12. One day that might be totally reasonable, and on another day it might be next to impossible, which is the second knock against classic periodization, which is there's no real mechanism for auto-regulation. If the paper says this, you're supposed to do this. It doesn't really matter how you feel. Now, if you're some Soviet weightlifter whose job is to do nothing but weightlift, sleep, and eat, maybe it's a lot easier to stick to that. But when you have real world issues and your job isn't to be a professional weightlifter, it's a lot harder to necessarily stick to that. Another knock against it is that you lose some of the adaptations you build in between blocks. So by the time you're at your peaking block, maybe you've actually lost some of the hypertrophy that you built in that first block because you haven't been doing the higher reps. You're only doing 1 to 3 sets of 1 to 3 reps. And I think that's valid, although what we're seeing now in the research is hypertrophy is really dependent on proximity to failure, much more so than volume. Volume plays a role, absolutely, but that proximity to failure, that seems to be the key trigger to hypertrophy. And what we found, if you hit failure at 30 reps or 5 reps, it's a similar adaptation and amount of hypertrophy built. So as long as you're close to failure, which in that peaking block, you should be, that 1 to 3 reps, they're heavy 1 to 3 reps. So you shouldn't be losing too much hypertrophy, although it's arguably a risk because the volume is low. The final knock that I think is valid is in the early stages, you're staying very far away from those heavier loads. Any lifting endeavor you do is a skill. The ability to express a 1 rep max with heavy loads is a skill. That's why you have that peaking block, is you need to get used to that. You need to teach your central nervous system and your muscles how to move under these extreme conditions. In theory, you will carry over the adaptations of all the reps you've done, and it will help that, but that's not always the case. So what we see is really benefit from this style of training. They really do. And largely that's because they need all the practice of higher reps at the beginning and slowly acclimating their body to higher intensities. Intermediates also benefit because they aren't as efficient at expressing their strength. Can advanced lifters benefit from this? And by advanced, I mean very advanced, like quite strong. If you're squatting 400 pounds as a 200-pound man, I don't know that I would really consider you advanced. I would consider you in that intermediate range. By advanced, I mean people that are pushing world record level weights. People like Ed Coan, 220, squatting 800, 900 pounds. These are very advanced individuals. Can it work for them? It worked for Ed Coan, but we have this rule in lifting that we call the Ed Coan rule. If he's your example, then it doesn't count because that dude was such a freak. But I think it's valid because there are enough lifters who did use this style and still benefited. And they weren't necessarily hitting those frequent heavy 1-rep attempts, whether they were max or just near max. And they still made a ton of progress. So I think even for advanced lifters, there's utility to this system. There's ways to adapt the system if you are one of these people who, for whatever reason, you do need a little bit more practice with heavier loads at a higher frequency. It's pretty simple. You just work up to moderate singles within your training and then do your volume. This has been referred to as over warm-up singles. This would be somewhere in that 85%-ish range. Why 85? Because our central nervous system views weights around 85% as similar to a 1-rep max. It requires a similar amount of inter and intramuscular coordination and central nervous system output. That's also well away from failure. 1 rep at 85, 86%, something like that. That's well away from failure. So that's something you can get away with. Now, it's not part of the traditional model. It's not. And I think if you're a beginner or an intermediate, you shouldn't be doing that. Maybe at a very late stage as an intermediate and you know your body well enough. Most beginners and intermediates, they don't really know their bodies well enough to know that's something that they can do without causing harm to their training cycle. Beginners especially benefit from this. I've seen it work time and time again with so many of my lifters. They just benefit from it. Intermediates, there's very few intermediates I've worked with that haven't benefited from some version of this. And like I said, if you do need to make tweaks, there are ways to do it. I think that's on an individual case-by-case basis. To make a generalization, most people can really still get a lot out of this. A classic periodization model. What lessons can we take from this? As much as I love a specific program and training paradigm, I think the more important thing in any model is to say, what is the overarching message here? What can we learn? What can we apply to our training without just blindly following the plan? And I think it really is this idea of the pendulum swing from high volumes and low intensities to low volumes and high intensities. This, to me, is the most important takeaway lesson from classic or Western periodization. There are a lot of different ways you can set it up. You don't necessarily have to start with that 8 to 20 reps for 3 to 5 sets. Boom, 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 working down. Okay, now 4 to 6. Now that you don't necessarily have to do that. You can play with whatever rep range you want, really, in my opinion. The idea is starting with a high volume of total lifts and over time working that down and shifting up the intensity. You see this a lot in modern weightlifting programs. They aren't necessarily doing 8 to 20 reps, definitely not doing them with snatches and jerks, but what they are doing is more sets at lower intensities. Instead of doing 5 sets of 8 with 65%, maybe they're doing sets of 4 and they'll do 6 sets of 4 or something like that and do a couple of exercises to match a similar amount of volume. At the same time, they're working into that 80-85% range much more frequently within a whole training cycle to not lose those neurological adaptation. But their average intensity, which is to say if you take all of the sets and reps that they do at various intensities and you average it out, their average intensity isn't creeping much above the 70% range, especially in that early block. As the blocks move on, now it's going up a little bit. We were at 68%, now we're at 70, now we're at 72, and now finally in that last block, maybe you're at 75 to 77 for an average intensity, but the volume is lower and you're hitting some of those higher intensity 1 to 3 reps. This model has proven to be very effective. And while just looking at it on paper with no understanding, you might say, this is completely different. It's not classical periodization at all. And it isn't in the sense of, we're not saying, okay, here's specifically 3 to 5 sets of 8 to 20 reps, but it is the general concept of we're starting with a higher volume overall for the beginning of the training cycle. And as that cycle progresses, the volume starts to come down and the intensity starts to go up, finally finishing with the highest intensities and the lowest volumes. This has been proven, I think, to be the most efficacious way to train, regardless of how you set up all the other little details. So let's take away today, can you follow the classic Western periodization model to success? Yes, I think you can. Can you follow a Mike Stone style, which is very similar, but there are differences as we discussed? Can you follow this style to success? Yes, absolutely. I've used it for success. Personally, I've used it with success with my clients. It's worked for innumerable amount of lifters over the last 40 years. Yes, you can do both of these to success. Can you make modifications and still have success with it? Yes, I think that's actually where you'll see the most success. If you build in some of the things that would otherwise be weaknesses in this model, it makes it even more efficacious. If you build in ways to auto-regulate, if you spend some time preventing some of the adaptation that can be lost between blocks, if you allow yourself to touch some of those heavier weights a little bit more frequently over the course of an entire training cycle, but you keep this idea of higher volume at the beginning, lower intensity, average overall, working your way to the lower volume, higher intensity, I think this is really, truly the tried and true model for any kind of training. So if you've never really tried any kind of structured periodized program, this is a great place to start. This was the first true model of periodization. This is where the term periodization was born. And I think as a lifter, you might as well start at the beginning. So give it a try if you've never done it. Otherwise, try to learn a little bit more about it. There's tons of writing out there. You can read Medvedev's book, get an understanding, run a program, and then make those adjustments. Just don't lose sight of the overarching idea. There's a lot of benefit to be had if you do. Now, if you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, we'd love to hear them. You can hit us up on Instagram. We're at Verse Fitness. You can email us, podcast@verse.fit. I am your host, Shane Robert, and I'll talk to you next time.